Greetings ladies and gents, and welcome to the batch video for Forgotten Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 50 to 53.5, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 50. Uno. I was digging on the 3rd level, or to be more precise, my drones were digging. Their upgraded stone chassis easily tore through the soil and the occasional rock. This deep underground, they even sometimes struck on a particularly stubborn piece of material. These were getting more common than before too. I should probably start researching another upgrade for those drones. I guess iron would be the next logical step. Anyways, I was hoping for the discovery of some new metals, maybe a petrified skeleton of some legendary monster, useful in developing some nasty surprises for the invaders. Yet nothing came up. Just the monotone brown and grey of the underground. Hours passed as the tunnel was dug towards the north, starting from the stairs chamber. I decided to leave the trail room to be for now. Who knew if the digging near it would have some dire consequences? It was still new territory, so better safe than sorry. After a few more minutes of digging, I prodded my drones to change directions. They moved westward, chewing through the stone and soil. It was quite zen experience, staring at them, busy and serious like ants building a new colony. Some time had passed, and I managed to drill out a large oval room. It had a nice, rich floor covered in the best soil that I could find, which should be enough to start my seeding project. Not wasting my time, I added electrical chandeliers to the mix, bathing the area in a cold blue light. The wire network came just after, high cameras popping up when sensitive locations, giving me the ability to react accordingly. The rattlings had hard work too, their little paws adding the tunnels to the tunnel to my new design, intertwining the emergency exits, small watch posts and warehouses with a ready existing chamber. Soon it was ready, an experimental farm smack dab in the middle of my underground. Or, for now, just a bare room with a large space of dark, rich soil in the middle, intermingled with the occasional rock protruding from the ground. A beginning. Let's get started then. For now, I decided not to feed the plants any magic, not directly anyway. Instead, seeds of various common plants were summoned and planted in the soil, with a small helpings from the rattlings. They had their own names, but I decided to call them by my world equivalents. There was wheat, tomatoes, watermelon, and a pair of different berry bushes. Then something resembling corn, small paprika, stout cucumber of unheard of size, and 3 or 4 bean-like plants in different colors, which needed a pair of wooden poles to grow. Then I had a radish and a carrot lookalikes, which with a slight variation of color and size. Each of them was planted in the corner for experimental farm for now, just allowed to grow at their leisure. If I was correct in the concentration of mana on my 3rd level should rather quickly show some interesting effects. Some of that part of the experiment would be complete. I only had to isolate what made them special, and bam! A magical plant ready to grow. Of course, there was no way to check which special abilities would develop, or if they would develop at all. But that could easily be remedied with a generous flooding of the area with my mana. Even if they wilt or explode, I had an unending supply of seeds. I was about to start testing some more volatile things when a commotion above the ground attracted my attention. The humans were at it again. I shifted my perception to one of the last surviving devil eyes to have a good enough vision of the blue flame noble as he quickly moved towards the place where Master Vincent and the merchant outlass Kramer stood, staring at the ground with serious expressions. Surrounding them was a large crowd of farmers and other unimportant civilians waiting in a worried silence. The atmosphere was heavy and somber. Bald Tom was also present, his large frame easily recognizable against his less muscular peers. He didn't dare step forward though, waiting at the respectful distance instead, still closer than the randos around. I guess that denoted his position as somebody above the common man, but with only 1 foot in the places of power. A few minutes later, Charles arrived, the onlooker's expression somehow brightening. Most of them knew that the red-haired noble was responsible for the miraculous survival in the depths of the dungeon and learned to rely on him when it came to decision-making. The man himself took the burden like he was born to bear it. The whispers in the dark attributed him every success to the colony and much more, destruction of the fallen tribe Horb being one of his supposed feats. Rumors grew, feeding on each other, making him out to be a superhuman figure and the sole hope of survival when it came to the Gaynard Kingdom, something that he was wholly unaware of. "What seems to be the problem, Master Vincent Otilus?" he asked, noticing the bold giant. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded towards him. "Tom?" A simple gesture, but important enough to have the large man swooning. "Sir Charles!" he shouted out while bowing. The two others also responded, their faces astir. "We have a problem, Sir Charles," said Master Vincent while digging into the dirt. "A serious problem," Otilus added. "I see." The noble looked around. "Well, continue this discussion in private, then." His voice took on a more serious and firmer tone as he addressed the surroundings. "Good people, please disperse. Both I and the masters are on the case. There is no need to worry. Return to your duties and let us work in peace." Hearing his plea, most of the onlookers dispersed immediately. The rest were convinced by the suddenly arriving guards. The soldiers appeared immediately after Charles, taking care of the stragglers. Even Tom was about to be displaced, but managed to remain after a lazy wave from his human outpost sole ruler. "Speak then, please," Charles asked as his tired face scrunched up while preparing for the bad news. "As you probably know, after the destruction of the outpost and our re-emergence, we embarked on a hard task of rebuilding." The merchant started. "Like most Gaynard Kingdom, the former Waltzer Castle allows us to grow both wheat and vegetables through the year, thus normally alleviating much of the food problems we experience." "I know. To the point, please." "Yes," Otilus bowed slightly, his face nervous. "The point is we can't grow anything." "Huh. Why?" "Let me explain, my boy," Master Vincent interrupted gently, stopping Charles's anger outburst. He rose warily, his old body straightening with nearly audible cracks. "You see, under this remarkably rich soil," he grasped a handful of the dirt and let it fall slowly to the ground, "there is a network of equally remarkable sturdy roots." His gaze hardened. "We already knew about them, but they were contained in such much deeper strata, and, more importantly, they didn't mind our crops growing beside them. They were harmless." The operative word being "were." With a small sigh, he gathered magical power without any explanation and blasted the nearby ground. After the dust settled down and the soldiers stopped panicking, an interlacing net of silver and brown tubes could be seen inside the remaining hole. It was completely blocked, and the recesses are under the wary eyes of the onlookers. The roots even regenerated, returning to their former shape. "I guess you tried hacking it away, or clear them out using either poison, fire, or some other means," Charles murmured while poking at the silvery growth. "Yes, fire, poison, arcane, ice, lightning, even brute force. Nothing works, and if it does, then the solution is only temporary. They regenerate pretty much instantly, and suck out the energy from the ordinary plants in the process." "They're a dungeon creation, then?" "Yes, seems like it." "Why now, though? I don't remember reading any reports about such behavior in any of the books about dungeon calls," asked Charles incredulously. "Maybe because there were no prior dungeons with 2 forcefully added entrances," commented Master Vincent. "That might have been the cause," admitted Charles bitterly. "Even animals tend to curl up when attacked." "Yes, I agree that this is a self-defense mechanism." "So, these roots, will they grow weaker with time, relax, so to speak?" "Inconclusive," Master Vincent shrugged his arms. "There was never a situation like this. True, some dungeons were outright destroyed when necessary, but nobody managed to do what you did, sir." "I somehow feel like that wasn't a praise." "Oh, but it was." The old man's face flushed with excitement. "There aren't many occasions to experiment with the dungeon behavior, after all. Are they like animals, curling up and trying to weather the bad times? Or are they unchangingly endure, like the oldest oaks? Do they want revenge on those who brought them pain? So many questions." He grinned, calming down a while later. "That's why I'm grateful to you, sir." Yeah, the noble waved his hand dismissively. but I notice a small tremble in the word revenge. What are our options then? Do you have any solutions? We can always hunt the dungeon rats for some meat, but other than that most of the monsters down there are undead, bad for consumption. Maybe we should get some meat from the invaders, piped up the merchant. Eating trolls, goblins, or orcs? We haven't fallen so low. How's that different from cannibalism? Huffed Charles. No, I was thinking more about those various beasts of burden they used. Call them barbarians, or you like, but they needed something to carry their supplies. Such animals are usually useful as meat sources, be it horses, oxen, donkeys, or the less docile beasts. Tell the truth, you're just trying to save your draft animals from landing in the pot. So, what if I am? They are the lifeblood of any merchant. Losing them means a pointless death. Not a literal one, of course, but still. A slow and agonizing fall into obscurity. Otilus corrected his feathered cap on his head, and besides, my idea is not bad. I agree, but it is still a temporary solution, not to mention that the elves would never allow us to claim them, considering our current standing. They would rather let us starve. Charles shook his head. Master Vincent coughed artificially. Yes, they're half owls, sir, not elves, sir. It might be wise to stop calling them that. After all, Lunar Kingdom and even the Elven theocracy are in a state of silent war. He sighed theatrically. It's similar to liking humans to orcs or goblins. You know that I don't care about the sharp ears, right? The red-haired noble answered haughtily. We were talking about starvation issues, interrupted the merchant, calming the two men instantly. I also have an idea, reported Master Vincent. I sure hope it's not about the mushrooms, murmured Tom from behind. My good man, these mushrooms would fit for consumption in no time. Not before half my workers die from stomachache, he calmly reported the chief carpenter. Anyways, it's not about them. Hearing the conversation, I decided to closely follow the Master Vincent did in the future. It seemed like his experiments weren't far from my own ideas. Of course, his attempts at playing God were much humbler than what I was working with. Nonetheless, it was an interesting turn of events. That's why I was shocked by his next words. There's a dungeon nearby. What? Another one? But wasn't that against the rules? The red-haired noble sounded aloud. Not to mention I didn't hear about it before coming here. He squinted his eyes, worried about and a bit accusatory. The dungeon I'm talking about is deep underground, under the protection of the dwarf oath-breakers. The words elicited another growl from the mage. I have nothing against the dwarves, but oath-breakers. They're bad. They're not outcasts, at least. Their word is as good as any other dwarf, smiled Master Vincent. They're called oath-breakers. For God's sake, how can I not worry? After the scream left his lungs, Charles breathed in deeply. Slowly calming down. 2 questions, he continued, visibly tired. How long one has to travel to arrive at this dungeon of yours, and what is its specialty? I presume it's something edible. About 4 to 5 days by using carriage. As for the specialty, the helmeted mage scratched his feeble beard in embarrassment. Snakes. A moment of silence followed. Really? The noble shouted again, exasperated. Really? Thrice cursed snakes. Oh God! Why, rats and snakes. That'll be the contents of my future meals. Who did I cross for me to have to atone in such a way? Charles screamed aloud, turning the head of the screaming surrounding guards. We do what we need to survive, mused Master Vincent, not ruffled in the slightest. I could even spy a small flame of interest in his iris. They're commonly eaten in the Dross Republic. Otilus mumbled wearily. Anything to fill our bellies. Tom's reaction was the simplest. He smiled gratefully, bowing towards the old mage. In the meantime, the red-haired noble managed to calm down. His face was still flushed and his eyes widened, but at least his screaming had stopped. What would we trade for the food, though? He asked, unconsciously poking at his chin. Our stores are limited, Otilus shook his head, a small notepad suddenly appearing in his hand. And the remaining supplies will last 2 weeks. 3, if we start rationing them now. There is something that we can barter with, Vincent mused happily. Then what is it? Don't keep us in suspense. Simple. The trade goods I was talking about are weapons produced on the first floor. These weapons, scoffed Charles. They're useless. Any dwarf worth their salt will tell you that. Any smith at all. That's true, but they have another rare quality. You see, they have been made from high-class iron. From us humans it is just useful, but otherwise secondary resource. Yet dwarves. Dwarves love this stuff, and are always searching for more ores or items suitable to melt down into ingots," said the mage excitedly. Hearing this, Chol's eyes brightened. "You're right." A wide smile appeared in his face. "It's decided then. We'll try your solution." Spring returned to his step. "Otilus!" he shouted, even though the Dross Republic merchant was just beside him. "Yes, sir?" The merchant unconsciously straightened his back. "Borrow a few of Lewis's adventurers and Captain DeRee's soldiers. Gather your people, too, and the remaining carriages. Ask Master Vincent for directions and lead a caravan towards the dwarf dungeon." He turned his head back to the mage. "What's it called?" "Snake pits." "Yeah, towards the snake pits," he mumbled. "Freaking lovely." Then he added, louder tone, "Do it! At once." "You!" The noble pointed at one of the surrounding guards. "At your command, sir." He excluded the man, bowing sharply, saluting in the process. "Ask Guildmaster Lewis and Captain DeRee to organize hunting rotations in the dungeon." The noble breathed in, staring into a faraway camp full of half-elf lithe figures. Most of the new squad should be on hunting duty, while the rest will focus on gathering the weapons produced on the first floor. "Yes, sir." A wide, bloodthirsty grin appeared on the soldier's face. "Remember to not engage the guardian on the first floor. Do not, I repeat, do not move downwards." Charles cautioned, his tone raised a near scream. "Acknowledged, sir." "Run along." The noble waved his hand in dismissal, and the man sprinted into the freshly built barracks. His loud laughter echoed as he enclosed space. "I hope it's enough," Charles sighed. "It surely will be, sir." Tom, the forgotten carpenter, dared to speak at this moment. He quieted quickly, aware of the awkward silence, and seeing that surprised face of his leader as he quickly bowed his head. Charles didn't even remember that he was nearby. "Tom, it is good to see that you're here. Please ask Master Vincent, that in his free time, of course, if he has a wish to build a permanent magic tower in the vicinity." A small smile floated on his face, only to be chased out by the expression of washery. "Also, are there any news from the capital?" "No." The large, bald man looked too tired, his spear carving first wrinkles of the otherwise calm face. The princess took the magic communication artifact with her when she left, and none of the runners have yet to return. With a heavy nod, the red-haired mage turned back. "We still have time. Even a runner would take about a month to arrive at the northern frontier, and then they need to get back." "Yes, sir." The silhouettes disappeared in the nearby houses. The speech was too quiet to understand, and I decided to return underground. I was staring at the happily growing plants, while my drones tried to dig out even more tunnels and rooms. Everything was fine. "None," iron-molded revenant, gain of the kingdom capital, Shilstar. The undead was prowling the night. It was not hard to gather information about Henning. A deathly kiss here, a clink of coins there, and the picture was born. Peter Henning, the first administrator of the Hawks, an important figure in the bureaucratic faction of the court, awarded with the rank of a baron. Titular and not hereditary, but still. A man who weighed the life and death of many would-be spies and assassins gathering under the command of the Hawks. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences, but always for the kingdom. Married with 3 daughters, Bella, Dorothy, and Cassia. Lived in a great mansion nearby, guarded by her Knight Legion and leeching off the kingdom's luxurious, like a great, fat parasite. A man of power and a man of wealth and influence. One of the 7 most important figures in the king's court. And right now, a man on the run, slowly crawling away from the terrifying shadow that arrived in his opulent residence. The formerly lit mansion, which was echoing with sounds of life, now turned silent, distant, and cold. No sound traveled the abandoned walls, but the lamentation of a human turned into a simple prey. The orchestra room no longer reminded him of the violence that graced these chambers. There was only fear, there was only despair left, and the maddened mantra, "This is not real, it's not real, it's not real." Peter was never muscular or strong, his figure resembling a pear, with folds of fat unpleasantly clapping when he moved. That never stopped him from indulging in the most beautiful woman, the sweetest nectars, and the rarest delicacies. It was his first time in his life that he regretted these actions. He regretted not training, not praying enough, not gathering enough personal power to escape this abomination. She stalked every shadow, a pair of black eyes following him through the estate. He noticed a sitting figure, a knight in full armor resting in a nearby couch. With a berating yell, he jumped forward, believing himself safe. "Wake up, knight! Defend me for God's sake!" His screams were cut short when he touched the heavily bloodied body and its macabrely cut head, tilting back and landing on the floor in a total silence. With a soundless scream, he retreated, landing on the floor with a wet thump as he hissed in pain. The cut tendon still hurt. In the beginning, he tried to jump on one leg to run faster, but he soon exhausted his stamina. Afterwards, he was forced to crawl on his knees, moving like a worm, tasting the humiliation for the first time in his life. He sobbed as he turned back to stare at his pursuer, with defiance born from desperation. "What do you want?" he screamed in the darkness, half hoping for the silence and half for a timely rescue. What answered was a hiss full of malice. Give. Give what? But please, money, woman, power. I have it all. Just let me live. Give back. What? Own. Area. Where? She asked with hatred, each word slowly crawling out of her mouth. Who are they? Peter asked, feeling the silent black pressure wash over him like a cloud. Girls. Underhawks. I don't know, please. I really don't know. He lied in his eyes closed, praying to every god, every demon that listened to save him. But no one did. Wrong answer. Non smiled wildly, her perfect-looking teeth leaving a mad, crooked impression. Penalty, she said, throwing something out. Eh? The administrator jumped back and far as his battered body allowed, only to fall in a pool of sticky blood. The liquid felt cold and dirty, but soon a feeling of something lying on his lap attracted his attention. Bloodshot eyes of the administrator wandered down against his own will, only to see the up-close cut-off head of his wife staring at him with an expression of shock. "Yeah!" The man's screams echoed through the empty mansion as the grisly trophy was thrown into the air. None didn't waste any time. She repeated the question. Girls, underhawks. I slowly accentuated the words, twisted like a venomous snake's. A shocked, wide-eyed stare was the only reaction. The Revenant watched her victim for a moment, giving him a chance. Then she repeated coldly, "Wrong answer." This breaks the spell, but it's already too late. Another cut-off head soars through the air, and this time the fat administrator was silent. He just widened his arms and sobbed quietly. "But Bella! No, this is not happening. My little Bella! What? Why?" He raised his tearful eyes, only to be met by a pair of black orbs staring heartlessly at his despair. "Why are you doing this?" "Girls, underhawks," was the only answer the interrogator got. I can't. Please, I'll die. My family will die." "Wrong answer." Words spill out with a shapely mouth with the precision of a dwarven time counter. "I beg you." A voiceless scream rose in his chest as another severed head landed on his already bloodied lap. He breathed deeply, lamenting, clutching and hugging the remains of his daughter. "Girls," she whispered in a broken man's ear. The notepad under the mage light table pressed 33418 and twisted to the right. He answered soullessly, his eyes focused on the remains of his family. Another, smallest head joined quickly, rising pyramid. But Peter did not react. He couldn't. There wasn't anything left out of him. All he could do was weep, desperately hugging what remained. Tonight, Peter Henning died, and nobody could bring him back any more. With the grace of a predator, none moved towards the table he mentioned. It was old, well used, and indeed had a large light above it. Upon its wooden surface a bunch of numbers was carved. Following the instructions, the Revenant opened the hidden compartment. Then, with bated breath, she searched. The hope that she carried in her heart beats louder and louder. Then she finds a small, unimportant note. Jonah, Beria, Tina, younger sisters, found inadequate, eliminated. Due to emotional connection, eliminated the older sister as she finishes the assignment. The Hawk agrees. Under that written in clear, bold words, Peter Henning, Chief Administrator. And her heart breaks completely. That night, a pair of voices howl in pain, scarring the surrounding urban area into submission. At the dawn, the military police finds only a scarred, broken man who once was called the Chief Administrator. None still haunts Shieldstar, though. It's time for her biggest prey. End of chapter. Chapter 51. Uno. I was observing slowly growing plants. It filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. Was that the feeling exclusive to creation? Who knew? It was hard to tell at first, but the manner soaking treatment was working. While the changes were minuscule and random, it reminded me of how people in my earlier world described radiation exposure in older movies and books. The workings of chance were exciting. After all, I couldn't call myself a gamer if I wasn't a devout believer of RNGesus. Like I said before, most of the changes were small. A weirdly shaped leaf here, a metallic-looking stem there. They were all adding up, though, slowly but surely. Even so, there were some speedy exceptions, too. They didn't fare well, but I had some fun observing their antics. One of them was a carrot that grew legs. Yes, an actual root like legs. It uprooted itself from the soil while starting to walk around in the gardens. I was curious about its destination, and so I let it be. But only after a few meters a brisk jog had slowed down, visibly shrunk, and then in 3 more minutes wilted and died, turning to dust. Too bad. Another experiment, a piece of common wheat changed color to red, grew a sunflower-like flower cup, and started burning. For a moment I was excited about the new defensive ability. Well, I wasn't sure how the plant was doing what it was doing. I speculated that it could be discovered by some dissecting. Then I remembered that it was a plant that was on fire. As if to answer my expectations of fire, sunflower produced some popping sounds from the stem and started to smoke. A few minutes later, all that remained was a pile of ash. I sent the rattlings over in order to make sure that the fire didn't spread. No sense to endanger the other specimens. After all, I doubted that it would be some kind of phoenix flower that would rise from the ashes. Some of the other failures simply wilted and turned to dust, like vampires exposed to the sun. I accepted that outcome as a reasonable price to pay. It was easy to understand that while the manor had an ability to mutate the plants, there were some unavoidable dead ends on the road of the random evolution. Still, I was happy there was this fuzzy feeling in my non-existent stomach. In my earlier life, I wasn't what you would call a green thumb. Quite the opposite, in fact. The only greenery that managed to survive my home were either cacti or similarly stubborn plants. It didn't help that I was frequently forgetting to water them, use fertilizer, or change their soil. Observing the evolving plants was relaxing, a great change from the constant fear and anger that I felt when sentience invaded. Speaking of sentience, my bliss didn't last long, as the humans started to pour down the stairs, fulfilling the orders of their leader. A team after team fought against my defenders, gathering my meager experience, loot, and then retreating. A constant stream of attackers returned with meat, fur, and bone harvested from my rattlings, or with parts of armor and weapons stripped from the defeated undead Libras. It was a rather jarring, but only being able to watch and not intervene. But there was much that I could do about it. After all, my control over this level was non-existent, courtesy of the anima used side effects. Slaughtering Libras was one thing. They were mass-produced undead automatons. After all, what hurt more was each rattling lost to the violence. What a waste of potential. I had plans for them, and the more of them there were available, the better. At least, the stronger specimens were staying on my lower levels. My other gripe was the fact that their deaths literally fed my enemy, filling both their experience and their stomachs. I felt as their rise in power, chances of pulling some stunts would rise too. Each battle won raised their confidence. Drunk on success, many of the delvers glanced greedily at my substitute boss, an enhanced power brain golem, as the system called it. While a great deal weaker than the Guardian, it compensated with lack of glaring weaknesses in the form of wires stretching to the ceiling. Not to mention that the first floor stairway was still bloody sacrificial altar lying inside, and this new defender was immune to the effects which gave a distinct advantage over its predecessor. Nothing much happened though, and it ended with glances only. The orders given to the sentients explicitly stated that no one was to challenge the floor Guardian. A healthy dose of fear after one of the squads wandered near to the room's entrance, and was nearly dragged inside helped too. The Decapitator was also just doing his job, his former kingdom cut in half by the dungeon collapse. No challengers arriving anymore, the place changing from a choke point to a dead end. The metallic monster was also not very profitable, the only worthwhile part of it being the veritable mass of metal it was composed of. The bile brain, being the only organic component it sported, was inedible too. Not worth the effort it seemed to be the humans to take on the creature. Jailer Jonathan fared not much better. While both he and the Libra minions were harassed more frequently and adventurous, not once did they so much without magic support. These assaults turned to more sporadic with time, the only draw on my undead being their armor, weapons, which rarely included a crackling mace, and combat experience against humanoid opponents. The pseudo-magical weapons I produce should be normally treated as quite a treasure, if the circumstances were a bit different. Right now, however, the local market was completely saturated. Pretty much any warrior who wanted to test our crackling mace already managed to acquire it. Normally, the surplus would be sold to the visiting caravan and sent to the Canarch Kingdom. Yet, in the current situation, it was clearly impossible. Not to mention the wandering fallen tribes. Even selling to the elves, well, half-elves, was out of the question. Considering their quite hostile relationship, I noted that both the short and long ears frequently used racial slurs and derisive language, not to mention their overall attitude. The tensions were high, yet somehow they managed to avoid an all-out brawl. While I couldn't exactly understand what the half-elves were speaking when pointing at the humans walking around, it was clear that their expression that it wasn't anything flattering. Anyways, back to the topic. I could understand a lessened appeal to my weapons, but it seemed like I was lacking a piece of the puzzle. It took me a few hours, but my ignorance was dispelled when I overheard a pair of humans talking about it. No, you see, this is a real weapon. The first man grabbed a large spiked mace and shook it agitatedly. It's just a lump of iron. His companion snorted in derision. Real weapons have some kind of enchantment effect or special ability, like this baby here. He smiled while carefully retrieving the crackling mace from the leather loop at his waist. Every move he took was slow and deliberate, like he was afraid to damage it. Bah! Toys! Snorted the bigger and more muscular man. You need weight to fight power, simple strength. His weapon hit the ground, leaving a small indentation, and lifting it up and stirred a small cloud of dust. Like this. No, with a simple negation, the slimmer and smaller man activated his own weapon. Streaks of blue electricity danced on the mace's pommel, lighting up the surroundings. One hit with this monster and you'll be out for the whole day. Armor or no armor. The small smile appeared in his face, and I can choose when to activate and deactivate it. Yeah, stow it. Wait until it runs out of charges in the middle of battle. At least normal enchantments work as long as you pour mana into them. If that happens, I'll just get another one from the dungeon. This time, this was a smaller man, turning to grow and irritated. Don't lie to me, snarled his friend. I bet you already have a replacement. I saw you sneaking in with the Garnard's team. The smaller person laughed happily. I managed to snatch 3 of them. He sobered up a bit. Nobody else was interested. At least the experience is pretty good down here, huh? Yeah, that's true. The 2 warriors spoke for a moment about random things while I digested the new information. Now I understood why my creations weren't that popular. the two conflicting emotions mixed in my chest. A hurt of pride of creator, and insidious laughter of the sentient stupidity. They never discovered that while my crackling maces indeed had a limited supply of energy, there was also one very important aspect to them. Their energy cell, or what I would like to call it, a battery, was interchangeable. It was a pretty, unassuming name for a long, sleek crystal, sending out an iron cone on both ends. Each of them was small, maybe 10 or 12 centimeters long, and 2 centimeters in diameter, but looking decidedly otherworldly, glittering with lines of violent energy, contained between two metal tops. An irreplaceable thing. And yet, the main obstacle I was facing when making new things was the simple fact that I lacked both knowledge and anima to create something truly interesting. Or, should I say, truly powerful. I was an average guy who had access to batteries, iron wires, and cameras. But I aimed much higher. With a huff, most of my attention turned back to the leading of the stone drones and digging. This time I decided to go with a bit of a different floor plan than the earlier levels. Unlike the sprawling labyrinth of the second floor, with the dead ends and the countless rooms, I started to dig an endless tunnel and interrupted the chamber every 5 or 6 meters. Looking at the map and seeing my progress reminded me of the old mobile game called Snake. More rooms were added in overall length, and the tunnel extended even more. An obstacle course for adventurers, I thought with a grin. And in the end there was a boss fight. Too bad I can't force creations to spawn behind their backs while they deal with my boss, I mused. Who said that I couldn't? With a laugh, I decided to add a hidden room at the end of the tunnel just before the boss chamber. 3 entrances were carved into the rock and filled with movable stone, leaving just enough free space behind them to fit some of my monsters. Maybe I'll go with exploding Libras from earlier, or should I wait for the kobolds to hatch? We'll see. Anyways, my work continued. My room after room refitted, lengthened. Sometimes a ditch added in the middle just to mess with any advancing sentient. That's why I was shocked at the stiff seeing of a sudden floating notification. The trial of a single combat has been created. Your dungeon has become host of a second trial. The second trial encompasses the sparring room. The rules are as follows. The challenger is allowed to fight in a weapon combat against 2 Libra spar masters available. The challenger is not allowed to use anything but his body and his weapons. Any magic is forbidden, including magic items. If the challenger forfeits during the spar, it's not possible to repeat the trial ever again. The trial is fought to the death or when the challenger forfeits. After successfully defeating a spar master, the large amount of experience will be awarded to the victor. And successfully defeating both spar masters during single combat, a skill, shield mastery 60%, club mastery 30%, or battlefield survival 10% will be awarded to the victor according to performance. After challenger attempts the trial, no further attempts can be made for 3 days, or 72 hours. What the hell? I quickly dismissed the notification and turned my attention to the first floor. The sparring room that black box mentioned, to be exact. What greeted me was a pretty weird sight. A spooked soldier and 2 of my Libras standing ramrod straight, with their weapons at the ready. They weren't attacking the human though, which was heavily against my conditioning. The human was breathing heavily while staring at something that I couldn't see. He was wearing the colors I associated with the Gaynor Kingdom's army uniform. Dark black background with a grey shield sewn in the middle. The rest of his equipment was comprised of an iron breastplate, leather pants, boots, and a helmet. He used a round wooden shield, a bit smaller to my undead, but instead of a club, a sword was sheathed in his waist. With an average face, average height, and weight, he was an epitome of a common soldier in the Gaynor Kingdom army. Seeing him hesitate, I turned my attention to the 2 leading Libras standing in the middle of the room, despite the potential victim fidgeting just a few meters away. At first glance they looked ordinary, just 2 undead clad in black armor with square shields attached to their arms and a mace clutched into the second. It took me a while to understand the difference. The way they carried themselves differed from common troops. There was a feeling of confidence in them, a sense of power, and most importantly, a glint of intelligence absent from the other undead. Their armor and weapons were also of better make. Iron armor and helmets completely covered in their flesh, while the shields they used looked thicker, and the maces looked more dangerous than those which the other Libras used. I took a deep, completely unnecessary breath and whispered, "Analyze." Libra Sparmaster, an abomination made from metal and flesh joined together in a mechanical union. This being is covered in metal, and some of it was even used to reinforce the bones and musculature. It uses a square shield to defend itself and a mace to attack. Unlike most of its brethren, this specimen is intelligent and has knowledge of both weapons and the use of tactics, polished over long bouts with a mirror twin. The Spar Master relishes the feeling of battle under the compulsion of its trials assigned to it. Under normal circumstances, it would train its lesser brethren in the art of warfare. An undead trainer! That's what it was. And with anticipation, I searched my mind, again hoping to find a blueprint for them in some nook and cranny, and found nothing. Of course, it had to be that way. Stealing my abominations, remaking them. I wanted to scream an injustice of only being side at the end. The only human present started to mumble something under his nose. It took me a while to understand what he was reading. Trial, defeat 1 or 2, then what's that word? He scratched his neck, longish and unruly black hair escaping from his helmet. Gain experience, or a skill. His eyes widened with shock for a moment, only to get replaced with greed. Just weapons. He glanced at his sword. No magic. A small chuckle escaped from his mouth. Yeah, magic. Right. As he stopped reading, I understood a few things. First, the man was a commoner, which meant the type of person despised the noble Charles the most at the outpost's hierarchy. Second, either he couldn't read all of it or some of it, but not all the conditions remained a secret to the challenger. Third, he was an idiot. I concluded the third fact as he unsheathed his weapon, stepped forward, and exclaimed loudly, "Fight me, you monster! Your glory of the Gainot!" The glorious rant was cut short as both Libras interrupted his words as the dual challenge was attacked with very heavy iron maces. The human sailed in a beautiful arc only to land a few meters in the back, somehow dropping both his weapon and shield. With a scream he huddled on the ground, crying out in pain. What happened later was quick. The human soldier opened his eyes for long enough to notice that the advancing undead had held up his arm in a mute protest. This, however, did not stop the Libras from literally beating him into the ground. When they finished, only a hard, recognized paste remained on the nearby floor. Since there was no sentient nearby, I quickly absorbed what was left of him and the weapons he dropped. Not much, but I wasn't letting anything go to waste. About an hour later, another soldier arrived and noticed the weird behavior of the undead. He stood still and observed them instead of charging in wild abandon. Curious, he came closer, only to be presented, I assumed, with the same message of his predecessor. Trial, skills, 3 days. He mouthed with difficulty. I waited, and just like before, a twinkle of greed appeared in the soldier's eyes. He quickly searched the surroundings and retreated, while muttering, "Wait for me, my little skill. I'll be back." Yep, sentients were idiots. Non-iron-melded revenant, Ch.50, Shield Star. Non was sneaking through the palace. If her earlier life she never managed to get close to the old stone monstrosity. Some people whispered that its oldest rooms were made of the last days of the Magi-Tech Empire and carried unspeakable secrets and horrors, or both. It didn't matter to the revenant, after all. Tonight she was one of these unseen stalking horrors. Non blinked through the night, her daggers at the ready. From one shadow to another she teleported with the grace of a predator, slinking silently and confidently. The sheer size of the place was both deterrent and a blessing. It would be hard to find the men and women that she was hunting here, but then again, she had her daggers and knowledge from another life. Her form coalesced in one of the dusty interiors, just behind a ginger maid, slowly dusting off her nearby chairs. The girl was cute, there was no ugly servants in the palace, and looked very inexperienced, but she somehow managed to notice Non's arrival. Her eyes widened in horror, and her mouth opened to produce a scream. The revenant acted quickly. A sharp chop of the larynx robbed her of an opponent's voice. The maid collapsed immediately, coughing heavily, tears flowing down her all-too-big eyes. She lifted her head only to be met by the cold gaze of the abomination. "Please," she whispered. None only shook her head. A few minutes later, she was already teleporting in a different direction than before, sure of her destination. The maid's bloody body was hidden for a long-forgotten compartment, left far behind. It would take some time before her absence would be noticed. She should be either finished with her mission or dead, not that she cared either way. It took her about 30 minutes to arrive at the throne room, most of the time spent hiding in the guards. She could slaughter them with ease, but their absence, unlike the maid's, would be immediately noticed. So she squeezed, trying to put her ability to the best use, jumping from one frail shadow to another, sometimes even stalking the patrolling warriors in order to find another spot to advance a moment sooner. In the end, she managed to finish her journey under the impossibly high ceiling of the king's audience room. Then she simply waited. Her main target still hadn't arrived. Currently, only the king, Eric Gaynard, his daughter Agnes, and a few guards mixed with the country leaders who were present. Normally, hearing what they spoke about would fill the listener's heart with dread. None didn't care. "So you're saying that the newest dungeon outpost somehow defeated a horde of advancing on it?" asked the king, scratching his grey beard. He was a tall and strong man once. Now the burden of the duties dulled his eyes and bent his back. "There is news from the runner, your majesty," answered one of the ministers. "I told you that would prevail, father." Agnes laughed loudly at the sight, full of pride. Yes, the young blue flame is really something else. "He has a name, father." The girl's tones turned instantly colder. The king only sighed in annoyance. "I know. Charles, right?" Agnes instantly smiled and nodded. "Your majesty." One of the surrounding bureaucrats dared to interrupt the father and daughter exchange. "Yes, speak, and out with it." Eric answered with a dignified tone. "Could you please notify us which leaders and armies were dispatched?" "It's a state secret. Why do you need to know?" "To prepare for the consequences." The people in the surrounding gulped heavily. Sending high-level generals to battle always has, consequences. The minister was pale and sweaty, but still stood straight, staring at the king and awaiting an answer. Yes, I guess there is no way around it, eh?" Eric turned his eyes towards the ceiling, and none instinctively hid, not knowing what level the ruler was and what skills did have in his possession. "The western fortress of Kojin will be liberated by the Heckin of Ash." He spoke, and even more people turned pale. "Your Majesty, there'll be no fortress to be liberated after Lord Heckin finishes his duty," muttered the minister, who asked earlier, with a knowing nod. The king continued. "I decided to send an iron hand to Grode to rebuild the middle fortress. This time the reaction was much better. Some of the people were even whispering with relief. And the eastern city fortress of Frist, your Majesty." "Ah, yes. I didn't send an army there." Eric smiled deeply. "After all, she is enough to clear out all the trash." Your Majesty, I sent Green Succubus to take control of Frist." He noticed the breathless crowd. "Oh, come on. She hasn't done anything horrid for years now." "Your Majesty, we all know the stories," whispered the minister. "And what's worse, we know that the stories don't even tell the whole truth." "I agree, your Majesty." A new voice joined the fray. A large, muscular man wearing a hawk helmet and clad in dark leather armor arrived in the room. Non's eyes brightened with desire, her small mouth twisting into a horrid expression of joy. "Lord Hawk!" smiled the king, even standing up from the throne. "My king!" the man exclaimed and bowed deeply. He turned his face towards the princess. "Hello, Agnes." "Hey, Master Spy." The girl twisted her pretty face in emotions of anger and simple joy mixed together. "Are you still mad that I forced you to get back here from the outpost?" he asked while tilting his head. A wry smile appeared in his face, noticing her unwilling nod. "Also, are these your special days in the month?" he said loudly while staring at her eyes. These were only a few words, yet they stirred a hornet's nest. "How dare you! Guards! Guards!" "What do you think you're doing?" "No, they aren't," Agnes answered calmly, squinting her eyes questioningly. "I see." He nodded his smile turning rigid. "Assassins! Prepare yourselves!" They screamed into the air, a blade master around him unsheathed their weapons, and running towards the king and his daughter. Lord Hawk unsheathed his own daggers and took a battle posture. None knew that a cover was blown. It didn't matter how, but there was still the chance to attack. Her body blinked and appeared behind one of the nobles, pushing him forward. The blade master defended the king reacted immediately, decapitating the advancing minister. Blood sprayed from the wound, momentarily blinding him and allowing none to cut his arm. The skin sizzled and the warrior grunted in pain. The man was well trained, though. He retreated behind his companions as soon as he felt he was at a disadvantage. Growling, Non teleported again, accidentally making sure that Lord Hawk could see her. The dagger was thrown at the people, shouted in fear as it closed in on the king, only to breathe out as it was intercepted by an outstretched hand. With a dull sound, it pierced the skin, flesh, and even the bone before stopping. Then it immediately started to corrode the flesh it touched. Lord Hawk shouted in pain and immediately dislodged the weapon, but the damage was already done. Still, he laughed fearlessly as he exclaimed, "Your assassination attempt ended in failure, little one. Surrender, and your death will be quick and painless." He lied without hesitation. "There is no escape from this place. You're a His words were interrupted by a scream from behind. "Tina!" Agnes shouted, covering her mouth in shock. "You're alive! How?" These words distracted Hawk for a moment, a light of recognition appearing in his face. After all, he was a singular person who taught every single one of these hawks. It was just enough for a revenant to step into his shadow and try to sink in a second dagger into the human's flesh. Yet, Lord Hawk was too fast, quickly using his already hurt hand to protect his vitals. "Kill!" Non hissed, seeing her target still alive. "You little," gasped the hawk. While concentrating, his body glowed and corrosion of the dagger stopped. "Deadly light!" he screamed, retaliating. For a moment everybody in the room was blinded. When they opened their eyes, Non was kneeling on the floor, clutching her now destroyed arm. Being an undead, her senses of pain were dulled, so she just only glared at her attacker, while whispering, "Revenge will later." Lord Hawk's eyes widened as the frame twisted, turning into a shadow and disappearing. "Find her!" he ordered, and the 2 wounds on his body were slowly healing. "Somebody get a sealing cloth and isolate these daggers," he added after a moment, pointing at the 2 weapons left behind by Non. "Revenants are connected to the murder tools, so we should be able to find her with this," he mumbled. In the back of Agnes was kneeling, her eyes full of tears. "If Tina walks the world as a revenant, then what about Balder?" she whispered to herself. Outside, Non was running away, a stump of her arm burning with a pain as the light energy battled her metal and darkness. With a grunt, she escaped the palace, her eyes naturally turning towards the north. "Home," she grunted as she shook her head. The smile that appeared on her face didn't look vicious at all this time. End of chapter. Chapter 52. Uno. It took 2 more soldiers disappearing after getting their heads bashed in and passing another week before the outpost's higher up noticed that something was wrong. An investigation was immediately launched, and soon the next troopers in line was caught red-handed, diving into the dungeon by his lonesome. Under a barrage of questions, by using some of the less savory methods, he quickly broke, agreeing to lead the outpost leadership towards his objective. I watched as a large number of guards, Redhead Charles Master Vincent, Crazy Guildmaster Lewis, and a suspicious Captain W.R.E. descended to the temporary stairs, smack dab in the middle of the conservatory. I suppose that it was a better idea to enter through here than risk wandering into the remains of the twisted tunnels, where the decapitator roamed with ever-increasing passion. 6 of the guards were chosen to lead this expedition, their faces growing worried when hearing about the task. Their slow and deliberate movements brought a smile to my face. While the conservatory was mostly safe room, it had its quirks. Besides the large silvery iron box with a bit 2 sharp leaves, I also seated some husky but otherwise unassuming battery devourers. The sentinels still didn't know their true value, But I worried, considering that the shallow level was growing on. It seemed like my past judgment was not the best. Beside them was the axe conifers that grew in the corners, while knife bushes and bone ferns cluttered in the free space under the trees. The copper grass screeched under the heavy boots of the soldiers with every step they took, raising a cacophony. After a minute, I heard the curses and hissing sound of the fiery dandelion exploding with acid. "What are you? A child?" shouted Captain W.R.E. angrily, berating the still cursing troops. "Now is the time when you set off as a boomer," he asked, calling my creation by the sentient's crude name. "Sorry, Captain," grunted an unlucky victim, while hastily taking off his boots and clearing the scalded feet with water from his leather canteen. "I don't care any more," W.R.E. sighed. "You," he pointed at the nearby soldier. "Yes, sir," the man saluted immediately. "Help this dunce with bandaging and rinsing the wounds. After that, escort him back to the surface." The chosen warrior nodded, but I spotted an unwillingness in his gaze. "Can we move on?" Charles asked lazily, while yawning. He was wearing a red overcoat with a blue flame on his back, describing the noble house that he was a part of. His gaze slowly wandered through the surroundings. "Yes, this is the problem, sir. I suppose nobody else would be stupid enough to get incapacitated by these simple plants." He raised his voice. "We may be on the first level of this dungeon, people, but should I remind you that all the creatures and dangers here are catalogued by our mages? Not to mention the fricking maps you have." He ended the near scream, and many of the soldiers embarrassingly lowered their heads. It was only now that I noticed that pretty much every single one of them had a sheet of leather tied to their waist, most of them glancing at them from time to time. The map in question was decorated with a few strange symbols and contained a simple but accurate enough representation of my first floor, with the broken plots included. There was a flower and a small ladder sketched into it, which should be a sign of a conservatory, an anvil for the smithy, and a small statue representing the sparring or food hall, and a skull with the crossbones, which should obviously be the way to designate where my floor guardian was. The human ranks reformed, the vanguard determined to stop wasting time. The large procession slowly followed behind them, wary and prepared. The invaders easily jumped over the spear trap and followed their bound captive into the food hall. Once they arrived, a few Libras armed with clubs and crackling maces descended from the pedestals in hopes of ambushing the humans. By now, nobody was surprised by the action any more. The trick with the undead pretending to be statues was already discovered by the constantly arriving sentients. If I was still in control, adding some real statues and maybe a trap or two would be in order, just to keep the invaders on their toes. Sadly, it was not meant to be. As the 8 Libras charged the enemy, Jailer Jonathan hurled an armored body through the kitchen door. I guessed that he'd already finished gorging on the stone-like food and discovered a dessert, a whole group of Gaynor Kingdom soldiers. With a joyous roar, he grabbed the stone wall and propelled himself forward, with the grace of a flying boulder. A second later, he landed, and the earth shook, and he ran forward, his sudden appearance as a shock to the advancing enemies. I didn't have any hopes for my first floor, so this change lifted my spirits a bit. Also, it was until I saw the Guildmaster Lewis running to meet my creation. While the rest of the humans clashed with the incoming undead, the bandana-wearing rogue took initiative, his charge turning into a slide. He easily glided between the giant's legs, while Jonathan clumsily tried to grab at his agile opponent. Lewis disappeared from his sight for a long moment as the cursed jailer was only confusingly staring at his empty hands. The undead soon changed gears, forgetting about the quick warrior and instead focusing on the meal that laid before him. Other human soldiers battling the Libras on the large group. Many of them were stumbling in the back. The food hall was simply not large enough to give them space to fight. Jonathan roared, only to have a shout of hunger turned into anger when an unbelievable sharp butcher's knife clearly separating one of his arms from his body. The screech of metal grinding against metal was overwhelming. I watched as the blade cut the iron, and then skin and muscle and wires before reluctantly stopping. Normally, such an attack would leave an opponent incapacitated, curling up in pain. Jonathan, however, was an undead. His only reaction to the left arm hanging only on a strip of armor and muscle was another roar and then a furious attack. He turned rapidly, his remaining hand slapping the attacker in the chest and sending him flying. The force of the blow caved in the human's armor and sent him flying a few meters back. With a loud crash, Lewis hit the nearby wall and tumbled down onto immediately standing up, his smile now more similar to a vicious sneer. The bloody teeth bared with an expression of joy. "Lewis, help him now. Together we'll slay the monster. Guildmaster!" A few voices sailed through the air, but the battle-crazy human only shook his head. "Do not intervene," he snarled. "I haven't had a decent fight in ages." With a scream of defiance, he charged towards the monster, another blade, long and serrated, suddenly appearing in his free hand. With a flourish, he dodged a wide swing of Jailer and then vaulted over the undead's back. He slowed his descent with both blades, cutting 2 bloody lines across the monster's back. The iron armor that Jailer Jonathan wore seemed to be completely useless under the assault of what I assumed were magical weapons. Black and thick blood slowly dripped down from the damaged flesh. My creation more angry than hurt, if not counting the lack of one arm. "Yes, this is how it should be done," screamed Lewis, and I noticed that the rest of my Libras had already been beaten to the ground. "No, surrender," he giggled, eyes glazed over with joy. "Can you hurry up, Goldmaster?" Joel shouted with irritation. "Give me a moment, sir." The bloodied maniac laughed and pounced back into action. The rest of the expedition was completely unfazed. Captain W.R.E. was refining his look, checking if the dark blue armor he wore acquired any blemishes. Unlike the common soldiers, he wasn't using a normal iron with a tabard worn over it, but rather a specially dyed and carved piece. The grey shield sculpted in its front was especially pronounced. Master Vincent was studying the bone lichen growing on the walls, poking the pale growths with water with his finger, while murmuring to himself. His violet robe and strange helmet were still totally unique amongst the sentients. I paid special attention to his movements since his core should especially be desirable. You never know when an occasion could present itself. But then again, even not-so-powerful mages were my targets too. The fight between Jailer Jonathan and the Guildmaster Lewis ended a few minutes later. I hesitated to call it like that, since it quickly became clear that the bloodied human was just playing with my creation. Despicable. Only I was allowed to kill and maim my enemies in a slow and deliberate fashion, and I would do so even more if the sportsman decided to grace my lower floors with his presence. As the deed was done, the Guildmaster cleaned up with a piece of fabric, only to lick his lips in ecstasy, tasting both his blood and that of his enemy. Some of the surrounding soldiers trembled with repulsion while turning their heads away. Lewis promptly ignored them. A minute later, and the expedition arrived at the sparring room. My 2 Libra spar masters were staring at the sentients with malice, their bodies unmoving, bound by the trial. As the soldier moved forward, most of the people presented inhaled sharply. They crossed an arbitrary line and, according to their expressions, were surprised by a notification box, similar to the ones I was encountering. It was already a tried and tied reaction chain, an expression of shock, then interest, and then in the end, pure greed. After a few seconds, faster or slower, depending on the reading speed, the eyes of the sentients sharpened, their throats suddenly dry and nostrils flaring. Most of the soldiers controlled their emotions immediately. It didn't, however, stop me from noticing quick glances thrown towards the higher-ups. Too bad nothing more interesting happened. Master Vincent was the first one to speak, stroking his ragged beard. "A trial! On the first floor, too," he nodded to himself. "It seems the dungeon started working on its 3rd level." I was surprised by his speech. Was this ability of mine so common that the sentients understood it already? "Are you sure, Master Vincent?" Charles asked warily, still rereading the invisible box. "It should be. If I remember correctly, most accounts claim that dungeons tend to create trials as soon as the 3rd or as late as the 9th floor." The only reaction to this enlightening information was a collective gulp, and a scraping sound made by human troops retreating a few steps. "Frick! Really? but the first floor is already a bitch to clear. 9 floors? The first floor was only beatable by the Salts of Hope, and even they got demolished on the second floor. The murmurs were mostly inaudible to the party leaders, but I could hear them just fine. So these tunnels can go deep as 9 levels into the earth, shouted Lewis. Unlike his surroundings, there was no trace of fear or hesitation in his expression. Instead, there was joy. That human was really weird. While it certainly was possible, I personally doubt it. Considering the time that passed since the dungeon was uncovered, and its current state, my guess would be that it's a maximum of 4 levels deep. Not more. I see, Charles laughed with relief, while the rest of the warriors reaffirmed their grips on their weapons. Still, marvelous, hummed Master Vincent, a fully functional trial on the first floor, with a skill as a reward for a perfect completion. Is that rare? Why, yes. Most dungeons simply offer some materials, experience some magical item. He nodded his head while stroking his grey beard. It's unique. I guess Forgotten Dungeons really are special. The grumbles grew quieter. If only these damn half-owls weren't so keen on destroying them. Too bad the divine box doesn't tell us what skills would be granted to the victor, mused Captain W.R.E. Divine box, I thought. What a curious expression. I guess it was rather obvious that they called it like that, because of Maribella and Brighton, the only 2 gods that I knew of. Somehow I doubted the Gangria counted amongst their number. Considering that trial demands a warrior-like elimination process, I would guess that there would be about hand-to-hand or weapon combat, grinned Lewis. His bloodied body seemed to be already fine, the dented breastplate ditched with somewhere in favor of leather armor. It's not so obvious, you know, smiled Master Vincent, his eyes speaking warrior, changing his tone to more serious. There were cases where the mage trial granted a physical skill, or where a rogue was given a magical ability. He once again stopped speaking and stroked his prideful beard. The dungeons are sometimes like that. Random. I grinned. That was an excellent suggestion. If given time and chance, I would use it for, one more way to screw the invaders. No other way but try. Still, according to the soldier, he glared at his prisoner. At least 2 other people tried and failed to beat it. And like everything else in this dungeon, the penalty was death. Do we really want to risk any of the higher-ups? Now that it was interesting, Captain W.R.E.'s words suggested that the other dungeons don't kill the invaders, or rather that their trials were less severe. I had 2 pairs set up already, but each of them was a type that the gamblers call all in. With that even more curious, even the trial was forced on me. The trial of combat was a very Spartan feel to it. More questions, no answers. The other ones died, sire. I saw them raising their hands in surrender, only to be beaten by the undead, the captive stuttered, speaking while trying to bow. Not only was he bound by ropes, but he also had a pair of chains clamped on his legs and arms. The dirty and torn dark blue uniform identified him as part of the soldier detachment guarding the place. "Shut up, traitor!" Captain W.R.E. slapped the speaker, sending him tumbling to the ground. Sir, please, I didn't know it was a crime," the prisoner cried out, blood flowing from the cut in his lip marring the cold floor. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse," smoked W.R.E. "Still, according to military regulations, the information you provided to the authorities redeemed you somewhat." He pointed towards the 2 waiting spa-masters. Thank you, sir. Your sentence will be changed to simply hanging instead of quartering." "What? No, please, no." "Take him away." 2 of the closest soldiers only looked at each other, shaking their heads and dragging the screaming and struggling prisoner back to the upper level. The rest of the soldiers straightened their back, wisps of greed disappearing from their squinting eyes. I was curiously waiting for the next words when a commotion above the ground drew my attention. The human and half-elven soldiers were screaming at each other, hand resting on the blades. Loudly spoken curses, faces filled with anger and disgust. They were gesticulating, pointing fingers, nearly brawling. My camera noted it all. The situation was even more complicated for the humans, because most human leadership was currently underground, leaving Carpenter Tom and Merchant Otilus Kamap and the outpost, none of whom had authority over the troops. because of this situation only escalated, which I wasn't too worried about since I was all about lessening the number of sentients. There was something strange going on, though. I wasn't an expert on human interaction, now more than ever since being thrown into inanimate crystal, but the normal progression of such interaction should be violence. But it was the elves who were stopping it from happening. It was then I noticed that some of the half-elven higher-ups were stealing weird glances at an empty space. Wait, there was something there. A shimmer-like disruption. It reminded me of how the Predator tended to use the cloaking device. In the older movies at least, not the recent garbage that was thrown into cinemas before my untimely death. I squinted, using zoom on the cameras to the greatest advantage. There were two. Yes, I think two figures were trying to, sneak into my dungeon. The humans were none the wiser, their attention solely focused on beating the crap out of the elves. I observed as the infiltrators climbed down the stairway and slowly made their way towards the boss room. Instead of fighting, they chose to sneak by. No amounts of nudging could force the enhanced bile-brain guardian to attack something it couldn't see. The situation on the second floor was a bit better, but not by much. The Libra explosives charged forward, but trying to pinpoint the location of the invaders was a chore. They ducked and weaved, appearing from the moment that they disappeared immediately. And while my undead had some ability to see in the dark, they lacked the life sense that was often attributed to them in games. Not to mention, zombies and skeletons, and these were fantasy equivalents of monsters, had any special features. They didn't either, and that much was similar to how undead worked in both games and in Yana. I was getting nervous considering how to intercept the intruders when I noticed where they were going. My reaction was to summon even more reinforcements, adding patrols to the Iron Flame Rats and the Electro-Touch Libras, while reinforcing the sentient's belief that they were going the right way. I banked on a game-like idea that the path of the largest resistance was the correct one. It seemed to work, as the invisible owls happily pranced forward, their sharp daggers even disposing some of my creations. Fools! Like the orcs before, they walked straight into a trap, towards pretty much the only monster in my dungeon that didn't rely on sight and was thus immune to the ploy. The glass progenitor. This monstrous tentacle was always hungry more, hunted the vibrations and sound after all, which weren't suppressed by their magic items. Or maybe abilities. I wasn't sure what exactly they were using. The elves stopped at the entrance of the underground lake room, probably surprised by the lack of opposition. I worried that they would just turn back and escape, but it seemed that my worries were unwarranted. Soon their steps echoed creepily in the gloomy room, the only other sound being a whisper of running water. The invaders were halfway there when the monster struck. A transparent tentacle shot from the water, instantly impaling one of the elves on the wall. He screamed in pain while hacking at the attacker with a dagger. These were, however, only small pricks to the glass progenitor. The other infiltrator only stared in silence, his face a cloak and showered in blood, turning the cloaking device useless. The monster wrapped itself around the dying victim, not many servants can survive piercing stomachs, and started to drag him back underwater to be fed. The second elf hesitated for a moment, but seeing the water turning red, he chose the only sensible option. He ran. In the meantime, I had gathered most of my monsters on the way downwards and upwards to block his escaping pest. I reasoned that while the elven army had a few hundred warriors, the Oni sent 2 scouts, or maybe conquerors. This meant that either the items that they wore were priceless artifacts, or the skills were incredibly rare amongst their people. Otherwise, what would stop them from attacking me with dozens of such squads? If it was an item, I preferred to have the chance to experiment on it. If it was a skill, then denying the sentients knowledge about the second level and destroying an important human resource was a way to win in my books. Or was it an elven resource? Anyway, my monsters were trying to stop the elf from escaping, and they failed. It was mostly because of the pure dodging skill of the invader, but also in his determination. Both levers and rats managed to wound him, however, even going so far as to nearly gouging out one of his eyes. Bleeding and exhausted, the sentient managed to arrive at the first floor staircase. But he forgot about the floor guardian. My monster was waiting for him, stone fist prepared to pound him into oblivion. It was big enough to block the escape from the room, its large build for once turning useful. I could see despair in a once of the handsome face as he tried to raise his daggers and prepared for the last fight of his life. And then a human arrived, bearing a strangely shaped butcher knife in my guardian's arse. I knew I smelled blood, he screamed loudly, pouncing at the golem. Oh, come on! I screamed even louder. End of chapter. Chapter 53. Uno. A half-dead elf, a crazy human warrior, and a towering golem was standing in a room. Sounds like the start of a joke, right? Yet, the situation was anything but funny. As if hearing my thoughts, the figures in the chamber sprung into action. The golem started to reach behind it, intent on slaughtering Lewis, who was tightly clutching to its back, as it was a natural reaction. Even if the creature didn't have the ability to feel pain, the discomfort of having its limbs sliced was still present. This wouldn't do. My goals were different after all. While the human was annoying as hell, killing the elf who had returned with knowledge of the lower floors remained priority. A small voice in my head was telling me that this course of action was just prolonging the inevitable discovery, since more explorers would come for sure. Yet, I couldn't stop myself. The secrecy was on one of the tools that I used for my defenses. The fewer people knew about my holes, the better. I simply had to try. Chasing away the idle thoughts of my mind, I focused on the present. In a span of a second, multiple instructions were sent to the floor guardian. Ignore the human, smash down the elf. Do it now, no dilly-dallying. The large armored golem halted its movements while pressing the torrent of new information. Its dull mind was probably even the simplest of commands, not to mention these complex orders. Its stillness confused the human, who stopped moving and waited for his enemy's reaction, one that wasn't yet coming. During that time, I tensely watched the half-elf movements, but all he looked exhausted. His arms were trembling and he kept up his defensive stance, laboring to take each breath. Drops of red blood were falling from the ground and slowly sliding from his once beautifully carved armor, which was now covered in cracks and smudges. The artistry defeated by mundane. There had to be a moral here, somewhere. No matter, the elf moved slowly, a wince of pain appearing on his face each time a step was taken. But he did try to walk forward. Lewis was the first to break the stalemate by jumping down and rolling quickly enough to separate the hurt half-elf by my creation. The scout seemed to be surprised by this action as me. I briefly wondered when the relations between the races got so good. They sure didn't look like friends this morning. Thank you. The barely alive elf coughed heavily, a string of blood flowing down his well-chiseled chin. The hurt warrior, unruly dirty blonde hair and tired bronze eyes. His whole face and posture screamed noble blood, but not much of it was obvious under the blood-smeared posterior. Oh, shut it, Alfie, snorted Lewis. You're going to get your beating after I finish with the big boy here. He pointed at the incoming abomination. Let's say you're a dessert. His wild laugh echoed through the chamber, forcing the unwilling half-elven companion to take a few steps back. In the end, he leaned against the wall, panting at red and black. Blood. Wait a moment. Why, the elf wasn't affected by the bloodlust effect. He should turn into a blithering maniac the moment he took a step into the room, considering that he was literally bathed in blood. Was it some quality of the elven warriors, or some similarity broken crap? My mind was already racing through the elven race's passives that I knew from different games. Resistance to magic, resistance to poison, resistance to enchantments, immunity to sleep, and illusions. Was bloodlust an illusion effect? Not sure, but I didn't think so. Earlier the pop-up classified as a black magic. Something wasn't right. My camera zoomed in, eagerly concentrating on his body, searching for bleeding wounds, amulets, active spells, anything that would shed some light on the situation. I patiently scanned each visible centimeter of skin, trying to look under the damaged armor, even as Lewis was going to town on my golem, chipping away at the large monster's stony flesh piece by piece. At least his magical butcher cleaver wasn't a useful weapon against this type of opponent. It gave me time to concentrate. Anyway, in the end I managed to discover something. One weird fact. It seemed like all the wounds on the scouts sported were already healed. It was a recent thing too, since the scar tissue was forming right now, visibly toughening in seconds instead of days. More importantly, the red liquid sleeping down the chin started to look less and less like blood, being both thicker and quicker to coagulate. This meant a few things. Firstly, and most importantly, it seemed like health potions were a thing. HP potions, pots, reds, whatever else they're called in games had many forms, but one purpose: to restore taken damage, sometimes even going as far as recreating cut-off limbs and regrowing shattered organs. To tell the truth, I was surprised that most of the healing items brought by the adventurers were things like bandages and antidote pills, and soothing balms. Pretty much none of them were official nature too. Worse, some only had placebo effects. Now it seemed that access to healing items of greater efficiency was limited, but they existed nonetheless, which made my little experimental garden that much more interesting. It would be up to fate to decide what kind of ingredients that I would be able to grow, but the possibilities excited me. I wasn't so delusional as to presume that a little boiling would do the trick. There ought to be more complicated steps in creating a potion. This road seemed long and perilous, but at least I had a few more shortcuts that I could use, like transferring the responsibility to a whole race of overly curious beings. Secondly, no one but the half-elves had demonstrated an ability to create or even use things. This meant that it was either pricey, rare, or simply somebody had a monopoly on its production, or race-specific. Or was just in my dungeon was too weak, maybe not important enough to warrant the use of such items. I didn't see swords or hope using healing potions. None of them were discovered on the bodies of the Boulder and Tina either, and they had a royalty amongst the ranks. Then again, that party might not be a good representation of how the Yana world high-level adventurers dealt with the wounded, considering that they had an exclusive healer. Thirdly, this meant that the elf warrior was only exhausted, not half dead. This rung alarm bells in my head. Even now, he was trying to desperately regain his strength before the inevitable battle. The only question was, would he have to deal with my golem or just Lewis? On that note, my creation was suddenly getting his rear kicked in rather thoroughly. The one dealing all of the damage wasn't faring much better, though. Lewis's face was scrunched up in a permanent skull, but, unlike normal people, he only grew stronger under the effect of bloodlust. The man in question laughed and jumped around like a monkey, avoiding the wide swings of my golems by a hair's breadth, even when struck by a powerful fist, and when his body sailed through the air, landing on the hard ground with the grace of a beached whale. He was still somehow able to recover seconds later. I managed to notice that his wounds started to heal slowly, allowing the guildmaster to contend with my oversized monster. Yet his battle prowess was all for naught, because my golem ignored his attempts to draw aggro and concerted attacks on the wheezing half-elf. The next few swings were dodged by the scout, but the increasingly spasmodic moves proved he was at least has his last legs. This constant avoidance irritated the golem, just like a buzzing fly draws the ire of cooks. Thus, my creation, which was normally a calm and slow-witted creature, decided to finish him for good. It curled up, cut, bent and scarred, stone-fresh, tensed, and gathered power. And then it jumped. The elf's eyes widened as the golem's massive body unwound like a spring as its silhouette appeared above him. There was nothing he could do. A second later, a wet splash of sound echoed in the chamber as the lithe sentient was completely crushed under the weight of my monster. I could feel the joy radiating from the dumb brute as it slowly started to climb to its feet, keen on continuing the battle. Sadly, it was not to be. Using the distraction to his advantage, Lewis closed in on the normally protected golem's head. With a swift motion, he climbed the slowly rising giant, reminding me a bit of the shadow of the Colossus game, although on a smaller scale. After all, my creations weren't 10-story-high monstrosities. At least, not yet. Anyway, the important part was Lewis made his way towards the bile brain, directing the monster unopposed. A moment later, using a two-handed grip, he cleanly cut through the iron cage that protected the squishy parts. The damaged metal fell on the ground with a clang sound, and pieces of flesh followed. The floor guardian tried to fight back. It reached up with its hands, only to stop when Lewis stabbed the squirming bile brain with his weapon. The creature's limbs jolted in response before stopping moving altogether. For a long moment, my creation was only standing there inertly before gravity did its thing and forced the abomination to its knees, and then face first onto the ground. This left a panting Lewis as the sole survivor, seemingly taking in the scene of carnage. And what a carnage this was! The room full of scars, mostly left by the missing attacks of the floor guardian. Some of the lesser cuts were added by the wildly flailing guildmaster and his butcher's cleaver. They looked deeper than those left by the bile brain, but were less pronounced. Only now I noticed that the bloody sacrificial altar had been destroyed in the fighting, its rocky surface smashed and cracked under the pressure. Judging by the damage type, it was probably demolished by my golem, trying the best to resist the attacks. I shrugged, considering that the new floor guardian was weaker than the earlier version and how the bloodlust effect was a two-edged sword, not to mention that I didn't have a lot of influence on the first floor of my dungeon anymore. It was okay. I could live with this. The human standing on the room breathed out heavily, shaking off his crazed state. Being a soul winner didn't come without a cost, however. The red bandana he wore had a lot of tears and slashes, barely withstanding the abuse of battle. The leather armor he borrowed from someone had already been destroyed, joining the heavier armaments he lost in a jailer Jonathan. There were pieces of it left, but deep gashes of blue skin were already healing, courtesy of a magical item or a special skill that Lewis had acquired. From all the weapons he once had on his body, only the cleaver remained. Both serrated dagger and other weapons chipped and bent beyond recognition. That was a crappy ending, he murmured regretfully, while looking at the meat patty lying on the ground. All that remained of the half-hour scout, my secrets were safe. Oh, so I thought, until I heard the next words he spoke. I guess I should continue to explore. He grinned maniacally. There should be some powerful monsters left, seeing how the owls ran with their tails tucked in. No. This time when you turn back, prepare and let me rest, I shouted in frustration, knowing that the only person who could hear me was currently coddling a batch of cobbled eggs. On that note, I probably should break one or two open, only to check if I've gained the blueprints. Considering how the Guardian cherished these little things, I decided to reconsider. I dreaded to make him angry, mostly because he was the only conversation partner I had at the moment. Not that we were talking much. The lower floors were still in the process of restocking. My Libra exploders were slowly making their way towards the central room, their production workshop far away from the front lines, both a blessing and a curse. I also didn't start replacing all the destroyed flora and the damaged parts of the chamber, which is why Lewis whistled, seeing the destruction. Now which creature could do that? He wondered aloud, his strange habit of small boon to me. That Charles Noble did say something about exploding stuff, right? He scratched his head, unwittingly freeing some of the black hair from under the bandana. I had little choice, not wanting him to do what the half-elves did, especially after foolishly losing so many of my trump cards, Libra exploders. I chose to send out a call to Libra's Iron Flames Rattlings to my creations. Most of them wouldn't understand the words, but the intent. The enemy is here. The murderous feeling. Stop him. Kill him. It was there. A roar echoed through my halls, startling and sentient. A second one followed. Is that a welcome? Lewis said undaunted, peering beyond the moonlit room. His expression changed a bit as the first of my creatures arrived. They were the closest and relatively weakest monsters. Libras. They came in squads, each led by a Libra captain. When they stepped into the destroyed chamber, instead of grouping up, they started to spread their ranks, deciding to assault the invader at once. This, for some reason, surprised Lewis. Did they hear me speak? The dungeon monsters usually tend to stay in their rooms, not to mention organize. They're the same type, so... They have leaders? He mused, ignoring my monsters and looking at the Libra captains with amusement. Unless all of these guys are just patrolling variety. His face scrunched. It still feels a bit too much, A shrug. I'm not complaining, though. His complacent expression started to turn more and more serious as the last of all 8 groups arrived at the destination, leaving him alone to contend with 40 reinforced undead. Both sides stared at each other, Lewis's eyes darting around, considering his chances, while Libra's waited for... "Get him!" I ordered, as the Libra captains raised their weapons, charging ahead. Just behind, their followers were closing in, bent on killing the intruder. "Crap!" Lewis called. "What did these elves do to rile up this dungeon so much?" He screamed while dodging the first few of the attackers. "Fracking delve killers! Oh, I'll punch the next elfie I see, even if I'll get me in trouble." His murmurs did not stop the advancing undead. Lewis countered attacks, slicing off a few appendages, the damage which would maybe stop the living opponent, but nothing for the already dead. "When in doubt, run!" he huffed, skillfully avoiding the enemy and choosing to break through the weakest parts of their siege. That was 1 or 2 hits managed to land, eliciting grunts of pain from the escaping guildmaster. He chose to run south, towards the metallic jungle and the iron flame rattling temple. It was a dead end. Many of my locations were coming, most interesting of them, a group led by the biggest rattling that I ever saw. While normal ones stood about 20 centimeters, this guy was a staggering 1 meter. More importantly, his whole body was covered in scars and cut flesh, marking him as a survivor of many battles. The oversized claws and fangs opened and closed menacingly, seemingly desiring an opponent to fight against. On his waist was a small leather belt with a few pouches laid comfortably, ready for the immediate use. And, like some of the other rats I noticed, his back lacked the spear thrower that the smaller cousins sported. The most imposing thing about him had to be the metal helmet attached to the skin and bone. It's defending the rat's eyes and head while giving it a menacing look. The metal was formed into a square with a small slits left for the eyes and the lower part completely shaved off, to allow for the biting motion. The human was running, but this enforcer of a rattling was still on his tail. After a few more minutes, and when I had to witness the decimation of 3 more rattling squads, two enlarged rat crossed paths with Lewis. Both sides stared at each other for a long moment before my rat behemoth breathed out a deep roar, and Lewis answered it with his own wild sneer. "What are you?" he asked, not with fear, but rather barely contained excitement. "Are you some kind of mutant? And that helmet, maybe an escaped Master Vincent's student." He laughed. Another, even deeper growl escaped from the throat of my giant rat. Then, with a practiced motion, the rattling reached into its pouch and took out a green-looking pill and swallowed it. The formerly red eyes of the monster took on a green sheen. Intelligent, using tools and magical items. Once again, Lewis's expression changed. It was entertaining to have someone that easy to read in my dungeon. He would still die, though. Ain't that a bit of too fast? I guess that's a forgotten dungeon for you. Another second of staring passed until the guildmaster lunged forward with a loud shout. "Die!" I wanted to observe the battle, and some small part of me did, but at the very moment more sentience arrived in the now empty floor guardian room. Because of that, my attention was drawn back upwards. I still didn't manage to clean up the place. Human presence only slowly dissipated since Lewis's departure. Much to my surprise, not only Charles but Master Vincent were arriving, but accompanying them was a half-elven princess and her shield master, and a few elves too, not counting nervous human guards. Both human leaders sported their sour expressions and were distractedly looking around, the mage immediately spotting the demolished altar and running towards it. Manilia, on the other hand, was drawn to the squashed remains of a scout. She crouched nearby and used her gloved hand to reach for something amongst the destroyed flesh and bone. "Was this one of your people, princess?" Charles wasn't the delicate man in the world. Even I knew that this was a bad way to start a talk. It seemed like the man didn't care, and yet, to my surprise, his conversational partner didn't react badly. Sanal Cloudrest was his name, the girl answered after a long moment. He was one of the rarely born shadow children. A what? A princess means those with innate ability to hide. Master Vincent arrived a moment earlier. his absent-minded voice echoing a bit. "They are born to the owls or those with thick enough blood in some of the other races." "Master Vincent, did you finish whatever you were doing out there?" asked Charles, motioning to the destroyed altar. Yes, sadly there wasn't much to analyze, since most of the enchanted circle had been destroyed during the battle. I can, however, say that it was marvelously, if somewhat crudely, carved and animated. His expression changed into one of happiness immediately. He was speaking about something he loved, after all. I was more interested in what it did, though. Smiling at Charles, his patience visibly growing thinner, the violet mage ignored the looks he was given, chatting away. "I can't really place the magic, mostly because it's one of the dark and primal variants, shunned and culled by the modern practitioners. The most I can say is that it deals with blood and the mind spheres of influence." He turned towards the elven princess. "If time allows for it, could I ask your highness for disabling the guardian without destroying this place? I would like to preserve the ruins in their entirety." He beamed his question only to immediately be shut down. "No, this is a forgotten dungeon, one which had drawn the elven blood already. Everything here is to be purged. I won't be a part of any research efforts, mage." "Well, no need to be so hostile, princess," sighed Master Vincent. Then he mumbled under his breath, "It was still worth trying, though." "That means that this poor sod was really one of your scouts?" Charles asked once again. "Yes. The other child, the shadow, is missing, however. I can't find this one's goddess kiss." "And what might that be?" "It's a secret." "Do you remember ideal?" sneered Charles. "Knowledge for access. Are you breaking that right now?" The princess stared coldly at the red-haired noble, both of them silent for a moment. Manilia was the first one to break. "Fine," she sighed. "The goddess kiss is an item which, when cracked, can completely heal a wounded person carrying it." "A restoration potion, then?" asked the visibly flushed Master Vincent. "Yes. We have a constant, if a bit small, stream of potions coming from our most advanced dungeons." Charles turned his head to the mage, staring at him questioningly. The man in question took out a small oval sphere and stared at it for a second, and then he shook his head. "She's telling the truth." "Oh, please," the princess sneered, "like I would tell lies to you already, a dead man." "What are you talking about?" asked the startled noble, before his voice was drowned out by Manila's loud orders. "Use the gas now!" Her shrill scream came as a surprise, as the elves immediately wore something that I could only describe as gas masks. A moment later, each of them took out a glass globe and smashed it against the ground. A thick, green gas started to fill the room faster than my magic could purify it. The humans started to fight back, drawing their weapons and preparing spells. Charles even managed to burn one of the assailants to a crisp before he fell to the ground. "Are all of them incapacitated?" the princess asked slowly. A few of the accompanying elves rushed to check. Minutes passed as they did the thoroughness checks. Only when all the humans were accounted for, the soldier's representative spoke. "Yes, your highness, all of them will sleep until death." "Technically, it's not true. The curse of sleep can lull them from between 1 to 30 days. Manilia took the fallen humans with amusement. If they were not in a dungeon, and if there was someone left to help them, then they could survive. But by using this thing, I'll be free to say that I didn't kill them. Truth-seeking orbs be damned." She turned back. "Leave them as they are and follow me. We have a dungeon to conquer and destroy." The soldiers saluted and followed her downstairs, right into the arms of the already waiting Libras. Not to mention the Libra exploders, who had already arrived at the central pond room. The first explosions rocked the floor, startling both Lewis and killing off about half of the incoming elven soldiers. I was sure that all of them perished, but once the smoke cleared, a big glowing shield was separating my undead from their prey. Just behind it, the princess's silent human was kneeling, his arms thrust forward. "Jake, are you all right?" Manilia screamed in fear, squeezing through her other soldiers. She relaxed only when she arrived near the armored man and touched his shoulder. Hearing his soothing grunt as she turned towards the enemies and glared, You dare to hurt him!" The waves of visible energy starting to arrive at her feet, like waves of a light sea. At the same time, the darkness in the room grew deeper, darker, greedier, and more monstrous. I could hear the terrified whispers of the soldiers. The lightless lanterns, the lightless one, dark child, they spoke. The lone one, a single of them whispered, only to find the shadows were growing deeper around them. And then the youngest princess of the Luna started to chant. I deny both light and darkness, and yet I glow, and yet I cast the vilest shadows. I am the lightless lantern, and I am the power just beyond your sight. O divine, bathe me in light, O world! At this point, she and her closest surroundings were bathed in light, and the rest turning so dark that even my cameras weren't able to see anything. I could only feel the lives of my creations were snuffed out like candles. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Lewis was still battling my gigantic rattling. I grew bored and checked on the garden, only to find it unchanged. Only half an hour later the chamber started to brighten. My electrical chandelier survived whatever that was, and the half-owls were huddled around Manalia, their faces pale and tired. Seeing as the darkness was pressing, one of them forced himself to speak. Your Highness, but please... He bowed deeply, turning to kneel as his legs gave out. Can you please stop using the battlefield annihilation spells on the dungeon's second floor? He begged, his comrades nodding with pitiful expressions. It's not the tires you out, but it also makes our job harder. I guess I overreacted a bit, she laughed shortly, but nobody joined, and after a second there was only an awkward silence. Not even the silent shieldman. This reminded me of the other elven girl, which also seemed to have a weak grasp on self-control. Was this something that all elven women had, or was it restricted to those with high-leveled ones? I guess elven harems are out of the question in this world, huh? My mind raced, focusing on random things, trying desperately not to think about the destruction that this one chick would bring to my dungeon. I ordered the drones to quicken the third-floor boss room preparations. The fake core also needed to be removed as soon as possible, especially with this maniac wandering the level. After a moment of hesitation, I ordered the rattlings to focus on trying to wake up the sleeping humans. If the enemy of my enemy was my friend, I would be glad if they managed to stir up some trouble for the elves. To add to my troubles, a familiar telepathic link was closing in. Need help. A feeling of pain and weakness was transmitted. Escaping, she added. Need hideout. A feeling of desperation, then hope. Home. Normally, I would sigh and probably refuse the girl, but right now I needed all the help I could muster. Welcome home, Nom. We're in a bit of a pickle, but you can jump right in. Teleport here, I answered while showing her a trap room just beyond the greedy glass progenitor. The trap room was turned into a small cell. The dangerous mechanisms were removed and replaced with a simple bed, a chair, a table, and a few other random things. As soon as the revenant teleported in and collapsed on the nearby bed, I whistled. What did you do, girl? She was literally bleeding light from her left arm. The corrosion started to devour past her left upper body. Not Guardian, she asked suspiciously. Oops. I'm also here, little one, the new, warm voice added. Where? Right now I'm taking care of the little kobolds, you know. You can visit. No, she can't. We have an invasion, for frick's sakes, I answered angrily. As you wish, my lord. Who, lord? Ah, frick it. My name is Uno, and I'm the dungeon core. Right now we have a rather big emergency, so please lie down. I'll try to help you as soon as it is possible, I answered in an annoyed tone. Enemy? She slowly stood up. Help! Help home! Her hand grasped at the empty sheath hanging at her waist. You're barely standing. Lie down, Nom. No. Fight. Non-sentient minions are much better to control. I sighed loudly. It seemed like repairing someone's body was going to be a priority for now. But non-sentient? She sputtered and sighed even louder, while the Guardian laughed hysterically. That's not what you know what? Doesn't matter. Just lie down, I'll start the operation. As if in spite of the notification box arrived just when I started to cut her flesh. Berserker Iron Rattling has evolved into Berserker Regenerator Mutant. It didn't sound bad, but why did its race change? End of chapter. Chapter 53.5. My body is a temple. Berserker. All rats were made for a purpose. From the moment they were born out of the womb of our mother, we gasped and grasped at the gift of life and the gift of knowledge that was granted by our esteemed Creator. It was at this point in our lives the Great Divide came to be, a single instance of fate granting, deciding how the rest of our existence was going to be. Some were given but a word, a letter, a number, the smallest of the small, forced to wallow in mediocrity until the end of their lives. Others inhaled through their long, greedy snouts in a single fleeting vision, one that gave them purpose, which seemed to burn into their brains in the solemn hours slowly passing since their arrival in the world. Even fewer of us were given a gift of understanding, the deep root of knowledge twisting our insides with passion and madness of a different world. This power allowed us to become something more, something greater. But, as we learned, nothing was free. There was always a price to pay. In exchange for a painful sacrifice, we were chosen to grow without end, to change in this underworld of ours, to serve the Creator with our claws, our wits, and our flesh, to become a pillar of the secret council. We were strong, but not the strongest. There was one existence which had flown higher into the maelstrom that was the Creator's mind and returned unscathed. Our queen, our mother, our rat prophet, the one guiding us towards the future. I, on the other hand, was just a simple rat, living a simple life. Or at least that was what I wanted to be. There was nothing special or different about my birth, no fanfare, no magical lights, nothing. On the contrary, I was even smaller than my siblings, just one of many blind, weak, hairless balls of flesh. It was warm, quiet, somber. We all wanted for the bliss to continue forever, but it was not to be. The visions came, forcing both me and my brothers to squeak in pain, to scream our denial, our sudden pain out into the world. To foolishly reject was what was given. This was expected. The experienced tender tucked us in, cleaning away our sweaty bodies with water-soaked rags, and one by one the rats in the net stopped screaming and squeezing, tired forms filling every space possible. They were reborn. All of them, besides me. I screamed myself hoarse, trying to escape my destiny. My throat was raw bloody, and mumbled words were angry growls, the undeveloped claws painting long shredded lines on my own flesh, forcing the tenders to bind me down in a desperate effort to let a youngling survive. I don't know how much of that torture lasted. Minutes, hours, days. In the end, my blinded eyes were filled with the sight of sentiment. A female, singing. Her form was hazy, filled with static, but the words she spoke, the words, they were clean and crisp, like shouts fired in the morning. My body is a temple, a shrine to the Lord, and although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for he is within me. And although my fate was to bleed and kill and to suffer, I shall not relent. For we are servants of the Grand Creator. We are the enlightened ones. The words burned as my soul devoured them greedily, growing and changing. And then suddenly my epiphany ended, and I was left within the dark, wishing frantically for the warmth and purpose to return. I didn't know that yet, but at this moment my pitiful self was destined to become part of the secret council. A sign of my ascension, I had acquired a new skill called blood courage. It allowed me to both regenerate and strengthen my abilities while in contact with blood. Its origin didn't matter. Animal, sentient, even undead fluids were working. I could feel my power steadily growing, just like it was predicted. But being on the receiving end wasn't enough. My body was a temple, and I was certain that each day spent training, sparring, bleeding, and reinforcing my scarred flesh was a living testament to our Creator's power. My stone-like bones were pillars that lift rich blocks of the flesh. The sturdy skin, turned hard and strong by the hours of constant fighting, was constantly covered in paint made from the sweat and blood, while my fangs and claws were temple guards, separating the grain from the chaff. I knew my strength, that every part of my young mind desired recognition. When the time I was granted a name, Berserker was mostly because of my fighting style. According to Mother, it was the title given to the strongest of the sentients from another world. They often forgot themselves in the middle of battle, reveling in chaos, death, and destruction. I was proud, ready, and then their pride was cruelly broken. My first real battle came, one against the strange translucent creatures, and one during which I taught was a harsh way of the world. It took only one attack from the monstrous creature to shatter my sturdy bones. If not for my posse of rats, I would end my journey right there, in the belly of the beast, before I accomplished anything. It was a waking call. I needed to get stronger. The temple was to be an unbreakable thing, otherwise how could it answer the expectations of our Creator? So I did what I could. That included asking my council brothers for help. They gladly answered, hoping to both test their abilities and show the depth of their faith. Crafter fashioned a helmet from his strengthened metal, a foreboding alloy he called warp steel. The silvery hue kept a greenish strength hidden, like a rattling layer, ready to strike. Mechanic and Mage worked on permanently attaching it to my skull, while scientists created a new type of drug, something he called the green pills. While the name was mundane, in effect was anything but. They enhanced my already great strength and reinforced the regeneration, allowing me to even regain lost limbs. I was cautioned, however, never to take more than 3 at any given time, otherwise the effects could not be predicted. After that came the training, and even more training. The temple had to grow, after all, and it did so as many flesh and bones were strengthened. And when sentients invaded our sacred lands, the long-awaited call was given. The Creator called, his pleasant static flowing through my brain. We all knew what that meant. "For glory," squeaked my companions. "For the dungeons." "For the rattlings." "Kill!" My low growl joined their voices, silencing the commotion. It came as a surprise, rats other than my posse not knowing how to react. I sighed internally. My confrontation against the glass nightmare did not end without any consequences, but losing the ability to speak was a small price to pay for a warrior. A long moment of uncertainty and fear slowly trickled down, poisoning the gathered rats with fear. Luckily, one of the more bloodthirsty warriors' shout was immediately dispersed the gloomy atmosphere. The Berserker had spoken. "We hunt! We hunt!" I nodded approvingly. Courage was good, but I preferred not to scare my lesser brethren without a reason nonetheless. After that sorry incident, we started to move, the surrounding rats flowing after me like a living tide. We ran through the hidden corridors, small chambers that twisted tunnels whose walls still bore signs of combat against the goblin and kobold scum. A scar here, a broken weapon there, a small indentation left after a missed attack. They remained, a grim reminder of our fragility. Not once or twice their path crossed over my council brethren. They also were compelled to answer the Creator's call with their own skills and forces. Tactician and strategist were having their hands full, coordinating the advanced troops and preparing to crippling strike against the unsuspecting invaders. For now, the untasty ones were holding the line, their devotion to the cause unflinching, even in the face of certain annihilation. Behind the common rats, Mage and Mechanic, for the first time under world history, led their forces into battle. Warp acolytes and rat mechanics were chosen to stop the advance of tall ones, latter the powerful green stones, and the former using a strange half-living contraptions. Young rats hurried forward, their eyes full of hope and greed. For glory, for master, for home, they squeaked while readily advancing. Many of them would be dead before this day ended, but such was the will of the Creator. Others will take their place, and those who survived will undoubtedly grow stronger. Along the way, I even managed to meet scientists wandering away from the secluded laboratory. A rare sight. Behind him, a bunch of scared assistants carried countless colorful vials, strange machines, and various pills. "Kill!" I mumbled as his servants shivered in response. "Cowards! Oh, Burr, is it you?" He, on the other hand, squeaked in delight. I nodded fiercely and continued speaking. I noticed that despite the passage of his time, his body was still covered in blue, vein-like lines. The number of scars and damaged skin he bore was not much smaller than those decorating my own battered body. What a surprise! How are the pills? Are you feeling any of the after effects? Kill! I answered, shaking my head in denial. They were perfect, produced personally by the claws of our resident genius. I had no doubt that they worked as intended, even longer engagements. Scientist was really showing off his new power after the creator decided to bestow the gift of warpstone to our kind. Well, we better get to it. I've been ordered to advance towards the first floor using our tunnels. My job is to make sure that the poisoned tall ones get better. His snout twisted in an expression of disgust. I know that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but it still doesn't sit well with me. We should kill them all. Consequences be damned. My only answer was an angry roar. Yeah, I know. He twirled these surprisingly agile claws in a gesture of surrender. I'll finish the job I was given by the master, but if in the process of doing so, a few sentients die or get sterilized. His voice trailed off and I could see an expression of wonder slowly appear on his face. The rats behind him recognized it immediately and stumbled against each other, trying to get out of his way. I too shuddered. Scientists' experiments were dangerous. There was a time when we worked together on this day, and I prayed to the Creator each night, thankful for my survival. Sensing the change of atmosphere, I nodded to the mesmerized rats and turned tail. My team followed, not knowing why we were moving, but not keen on asking. Perks of being a boss, I guess. Even after we left, I could still hear the echoing whispers. They have cores, right? I wonder how would they interact with a warpstone, or maybe just an incision. Will soft meat wither when exposed to the glorious anima crystals, or would it mutate? What about the eyes? Scientist mumbled under his snout. Yes, what about the eyes? I shuddered. It seemed like the other tall ones were up to some bad awakening. Not that it mattered. They would all die in the end. Our Creator demanded so. And speaking of dying, our small group was closing in on our target. A lone warrior we were chasing still advanced crazily, not looking back. I could see the glory in that. To burn brightly before his demise was a good thing. My nose twitched, instantly stopping the remunerations. I smelt blood. Rattling and human blood, but it was a former scent that dominated the air. Seconds later, we arrived at the battlefield. Corpses of various stages of disembowelment were strewn about the scene, straight out of a nightmare. The air was heavy and wet, and with an added flavor of sweat, urine, and fear dispersing slowly. And amongst the bodies stood an invader, a black-haired man wearing scraps of leather armor and rags that were once modest clothes. Once a red bandana now looked to be a scrap of waste. In his hands was a strange butcher knife that was vibrating with a hidden energy, slowly devouring the fluids covering the blade. It was a bewitching, terrible sight, one that I welcomed. An opponent. A real opponent granted by the Creator. I roared loudly while my face distorted into a happy sneer. Not all the human could tell. Kill. The man responded with a laugh of his own. His eyes were anticipating a surprise strike and searching for the right angle of attack. Perfect. What are you? He asked, not with fear, but barely contained excitement. Are you some kind of mutant? And that helmet? Maybe an escaped Master Vincent student? I roared with laughter again. Kill, I answered with a deeper emotion. Fulfillment. To kill or to be killed. Seeing him observing my form, I used the time to repeat my mantra. Prepare, never underestimate the opponent. A green pill ended up in my mouth, a motion I trained 100,000 times. The small pouch that I carried on my waist had about 20 portions left, but the usage limit was still fresh in my mind. I did not want to die before fulfilling my duty. After I swallowed the drug and feeling the strength slowly travel through my veins, reinforcing my bones, muscles, and making my mind swell faster, I stared at the human with amusement as he spoke. Intelligent, using tools and magical items. His expression changed. Ain't that a bit too fast? I guess that's a forgotten dungeon for you. The man complained playfully, still talking to himself. And then he lunged forward with a scream. Die! It was a decent attack, quick, ruthless, and utterly brutal. Butcher knives aren't known for their precision after all. He swung it down, aiming to disable my left arm, but I instantly dodged, starting to swipe at my own. The attack missed, cutting through the ground instead, and a deep gouge showing both the human strength and the weapon's might. My swipe didn't find its target too. Agilely used the momentum and fell forward, spinning and a bit before landing. "Ta-da!" he gestured, but I reacted with another attack. This time I opted for a charge. My helmet was made from the strongest metal known to rats, after all. Raising speed, I flew forward, my legs and arms barely touching the floor. The air cried, torn apart by my quickly moving flesh. Then the sound stopped, and I felt the sound of collision together with the screeching of the abused metal. Even under the effects of inertia, the human managed to slip away, hurt but not dead. I ended up headbutting the wall, a tremor of force nearly knocking me out. We both turned to stare at each other in surprise. "How the hell?" the invader stuttered, looking at the nicked blade. "This is a magical weapon, for frick's sake." I checked the integrity of my helmet and was shocked to find it nicked in the warp steel's smooth surface. It seemed like our equipment was on par. A few more bouts followed, both me and the human scoring hits, but not weakening each other. It seemed like his ability was similar to mine. The blood helped him to keep and regenerate, at least until I swallowed my second pill. My muscles grew explosively, but it wasn't all strength. An explosive gain in speed was also experienced. Small green lines started to appear on my flesh, reminding me of how the scientist looked after a few catastrophic experiments. The human's answer was simple. "Frack you, you cheater," he mumbled, his eyes slowly losing the spark with which he started our battle. I decided to end the fight, all the more since I could hear the constant explosions from the direction where most of our forces advanced. I felt restless. The sentients should already be dead, and yet the battle continued. 4 more attacks, and the invader was on the ropes, stumbling back, like a marionette with broken strings. I lunged forward, both my claws piercing its shoulders with wet sounds. A small scream of pain bellowed, the man immobilized against the wall. I opened my mouth to bite off his head, finishing the battle with my favor, only to hear him whisper, "It's a draw, Frecker." With the strength surprising of a half-dead person, he lifted his damaged butcher cleaver and cut straight into my belly, spilling blood and guts on the ground. I started to feel cold, weakness spreading from the wound, but the last spur to my jaw, I clamped down at his neck, severing his head from the rest of his body. After that, both me and the sentient fell to the ground. He, a dead pile of flesh, me, a soon-to-be-dead rattling. I could hear my subordinates screaming and panicking, their squeaks filling the air. My snout unknowingly stretched itself to expression of happiness. Such loyal little rats, I thought, feeding the darkness just behind the corner, waiting to claim me. But it didn't. Instead, a red-hot pain seared up through the wound, traveling through my flesh and bone. It hurt. It hurt so much that I wanted to die, a long, piercing scream building up and never leaving my damaged lungs. Ah! And again, the waves of fire continued to travel through my flesh. I could feel myself changing. My stomach would be repairing itself, my brain, my head, growing and filling all the space left in the warp steel helmet. Both the legs and spine filling the muscles, tendons, and forcing me to stand upright. The arms grew slender but still powerful, claws turning to fingers, and I couldn't see my face, but the snout was always there where it simply disappeared. And most of all, what is happening? I could talk. The explosions once again rocked the dungeon's second floor. Wonder had to wait. There were rats in dire need of help. End of chapter. And that concludes the video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so below. I'll see you all in the next video, and I hope that you all have a good one. Until then, cheers.